So the next step is talking about dilutions. So what actually is a dilution? A dilution means making a solution weaker by adding more solvent. Usually the solvent is water in this case. So I always think about dilutions in terms of squash. You add squash to a glass, and the more water, solvent you add, the more dilute it becomes. The amount of solute, in this case, a lot of cases it's the drug in pharmacy calculations, stays the same. So think about it in terms of the squash again. The amount of squash actually stays the same, but the amount of solvent is what is the only thing that's changing. You're either adding more than before or you're adding less. But remember, if you're adding more of the solvent, then your volume is going to increase. So this concentration will decrease. So always try and think of dilutions in terms of squash and drinks, because it gets quite difficult. And this is probably one of the most challenging concepts in pharmacy calculations. I think most people dread dilutions, but that's the best way I can think about how to do them. So there's two key equations that you need to know to do dilution questions. There's C1V1 is equal to C2V2. So C1 is the initial concentration, so that's why it's the concentration on 1. V1 is the initial volume, or the volume of the solution taken. And then C2 is the final concentration, and V2 is the final volume. A lot of the time in questions, people say, well, how do I know which one to label C1 and which one to label V1? Can I just put any? You just have to read the question really well. I always think, well, C1 and V1 is what you have, and C2 and V2 a lot of the time is what you're going to make or the pharmacist wants to prepare. So that's how I distinguish between the two. Then, another equation that you need to know is something called the ratio strength after dilution. So the equation is the new ratio. So obviously you have 1 to 10, 1 in 10 dilutions is equal to the old ratio times by the dilution factor. I'm putting DF for dilution factor. And then the last equation you need to know is the dilution factor is equal to the final volume over the initial volume. So those are the three key equations that I keep in my head when I'm trying to deal with dilutions, because it gets quite difficult, but it kind of breaks it down a bit when you have three equations and you just have to think in your head, which one of the three do I have to use, instead of getting confused. So I thought we could tackle some questions to see how we go. So the first example I have is based on percentage strength. So this is a very standard dilution question. You have 100 ml of 20% weight over volume solution. If you dilute it to 400 ml, what is the new strength? So I always look at how many numbers do I actually have. I always try and lead with C1V1 first, and if it doesn't fit the criteria of C1V1, then I think of the other equations that I just mentioned. So from the back, I can see that I've got 3 numbers in the equation. So a lot of the time I will lean towards C1V1 when you've got 3 and missing 1, because then you can rearrange the formula to find X, and then that's what you're looking for. So that's my quick tips on how I figure out which one to use and what to do. So because I look at how many numbers there are in the equation, or the question, sorry. So now that I know it's C1V1 because of the amount of numbers, but also look at the way that the question's worded. So you have 100 ml and 20% weight over volume solution. So I know already that's going to be my V1. This is going to be my C1. If you dilute it to 400 ml, so that's what we're ending up with. That's our V2 in volume. What is the new percentage strength? So we want to find our C2, which is equal to X. So that's another way I deal with it, and how I decide which one's C1 and which one's V1 or C1 or V2, sorry, and C2, by reading the question and thinking, what do I actually have right now and what do I want to get up to? Then you kind of just sub it in. So C1V1 is equal to C2V2. So we've got a C1V1 is 20 times by 100 is equal to X times by 400. Now you do simple algebra. We want X on its own, so we move the 400 to the other side. So you end up getting this sort of formula going on. So 20 times by 100 divided by 400 is what is going to be our X value. So if I just put that in the calculator, so 20 times by 100 is 2000. And then we're going to divide that by 400. We'll cancel out all my zeros. So 20 divided by 4, you get 5. So our percentage strength is 5%. A little disclaimer with questions like this, the way that it gets hard is when they say, oh, you have 100 mil of a 1 in 50 solution, so a ratio strength instead of a percentage strength, but then they want you to find out what the new concentration is as a percentage strength. So my best advice to you is convert it into the one that you feel most comfortable with. So if I always see 1 in 50, I would automatically convert that to percentage strength, because you have to keep them in the same sort of metric to even put them in C1V1. You can't just put 1 in 50 and then a percentage strength in, because it's just not going to work. You're going to get a weird answer. So keep all your units the same and corresponding for the concentration and volume for your equation, and that's how you'd get the right answer. So just be careful with things like that. Then I've got another question, and this one's to do with ratio strength. So same principle, but we're just dealing with ratio strength. So we've got, if 200 ml of a 1 in 400 solution is diluted to 1,000 ml, what is the final ratio strength? So we could use C1V1, but it's a bit tricky because we haven't got much information. So what I would do is, we've actually been told like what we're diluting the solution by. So we know that we've got 250 ml of 1 in 400 solution is diluted to 1,000 ml. So we've got this 200 ml solution, and we want to dilute it up to a increased volume of 1,000 ml. So I deal with the volumes first, because then if you've got two volumes, you can work out the dilution factor. So to work out the dilution factor, if we look at our equations above, we can do dF is equal to the final volume divided by the initial volume. So all we do here is 1,000 divided by 200, and we find out our dilution factor is 5. I've just put in dF in brackets. Then what we do to find our new ratio is we use that second equation. So we can do the new is equal to the old times by the dilution factor. Well, we don't know, we want to find the new. We will then use our old, which is 1 in 400. So we only use the value of X, which is 1 in something. So we only use 400. Then we're going to times that by our dilution factor, which is 5. And you should get a ratio of strength of 1 in 2,000. Oh, so yeah, this is kind of complicated, because the reason why we didn't use the dilution factor, or you could use a dilution factor in this, it's just a bit longer because you'd have to convert straight from percentage strengths. But when you have ratio strengths instead, it's better to essentially work in terms of a dilution factor, because you get to the answer a lot quicker. So what I did was I worked out the dilution factor by doing the final divided by the initial, and then I made sure to use this sort of concentration and times it by the dilution factor to find out what the new concentration would be. Then we've got our final question, which is how much water must be added to 250 ml of a 2 molar NaCl solution to dilute it to 0.5 molar. This incorporates molarity. Now, we've dealt with molarity in the previous videos. So what I like to do is I look at my units. So a lot of our units are corresponding. We've still got molar and we've got molar here. And then we've got mils, and we need to work out how much water is it in. So I presumably would think mils. So when I know that I've got units that are somewhat the same, then I like to sub it into C1V1. So we've got C1V1 equals C2V2. How much water must be added to 250 ml? So of 2 molar to dilute it to 0.5 molar. Well, we want to dilute it to 0.5 molar. So that's what we want to get. So that's my C2, meaning that's my C1. And that's my V1. And then we're working out V2. So then we just sub it into the equation. You do 2 times 250. I have rearranged the equation already like I did in the beginning and divided by that 0.5. We sub it into the equation and you should get 1000 mil is what is the final volume. Now be careful, this V1 is the final volume. It's not the how much water you add. It's just what you're going to get at the end to have the overall concentration to be 0.5. Now why I'm saying this is because you need to just do 1000 minus 250 to see how much water you needed to actually add to get it to that final volume of 1000 mil. So that's how they trick you in some certain ways to make sure that you actually know the technique, but the wording in some cases was just hard to understand. So again, I'll do some practice questions and we'll go through them, and there'll be answer solutions in the course.